I'd like to tell you about a couple of things. One is this idea and concept that I've been thinking about since April 1st, 1983. So I've had a little time to stir on it. So I'm going to tell you a bit about that. And I want to tell you about an effort that I'm helping to lead this fall, September 6th to November 6th, called Vote Common Good. I set some cards out on the table for you. And there's little index cards. Some of your tables or chairs also have a pen on them. Those index cards are for you to write down your name, zip code, and email address if you'd like to be on a list about what I'm about to tell you about. Vote Common Good is an effort that a number of us really felt like visited us, fell on us, we stumbled onto just after Memorial Day. I think it was the 3rd of June. We were in a meeting, sort of like a Wild Goose Festival thing, and it dawned on us that some of us feel that the country is in a really serious crisis and dangerous situation due to the choices of the Trump administration, and in our view, a complicit Congress that's causing harm to children, harm to adults, and really is a problem in the country. Look, I have a lot of feelings about Donald Trump. Included in those are, he is the salt of the earth and the light of the world, just like all of us. He is a beloved one of God, a full human being that deserves all the respect of a human being and should be granted all the goodness and grace that all the rest of us are extended. There's no qualification in my mind about that. That's a full stop without conditions. And he's totally unqualified to be the president of the United States. You might feel that you are too. This is not a personal attack for me on him, but he should not have offered himself. And I think that religious people who rallied around him should not have been complicit in helping him to take on a role that I feel not only he has no business to do, no temperament to do, but lacks the moral standing to be in that role. And it's not just I liked the other one, the woman, better, and I wanted that guy, and now I'm all angry about it. That's true, but that motivation is it's really causing serious damage to the country and to people's lives, and it needs to stop. In our government, we are a for the people, by the people, of the people kind of government, and we have a remedy for this. The founders anticipated a president like this. What they did not anticipate was that the other branches of government would be complicit in a president like this. They put in place a response to this kind of thing. So we're trying to move along and motivate the other branch of government, the legislative branch, to do something about it. So the current Republican-held Congress is unable and unwilling to do anything about the damage that's happening to the country, in my view. So we're going to go around to 46 congressional districts with a merry band of Vote Common do-gooders in a caravan of hope and love and joy and passion, and invite for people to vote the common good. And in this particular circumstance, on this time, on these days, that means we have to flip Congress. Now, I'm not just a Democrat shill. I'm not somebody who just says we need to have Democrats and Democrats only. There very well could be a time when Vote Common do-gooders need to travel the country and say that Democratic Congress refuses to do the things it needs to do to protect the planet and to protect the vulnerable and to protect people. And we'll rally up a bunch of people to bring the common good into their lives as well. But right now, that's not our situation. Right now, it is a complicit Republican-held Congress that statedly refuses to do anything about this. So we're going to whip up some people, and we're going to travel 16,000 miles into 25 states, into 46 towns, and ask people there, especially religiously motivated voters who have tended to reflexively vote Republican in the past, and because of their conscience and their faith, they just can't do it any longer, to consider, at least in this election, to do something they may have never done before, and to consider voting either for the common good or for voting for a Democrat. Doesn't mean you have to be one. Doesn't mean you have to support them. It means you want to do something about the circumstance and situation we find ourselves in right now. So that's basically what we're up to at Vote Common Good. If you want to know more about it, you fill out that card. I'd be glad to tell you about it. It really matters to me. All right, so end of sales pitch on Vote Common Good. But if you catch me later, I will gladly go on for an hour or two about it with you. And there's a whole table down along the way, and I'd be glad to talk to you there at that table or here if you'd like to. All right, so here's the thing I've been thinking about since 1983. If that's something we've been thinking about since like 5 weeks ago over Memorial Day, this thing I've been thinking about since 1983. And it's this phrase of Jesus that I don't remember when in 1983 I first ran across it, but somewhere in my early days, the phrase of Jesus where he says, "Those who believe in me will do the works that I'm doing and do even greater works than these." And that idea that Jesus has an imagination for the future, that Jesus has an imagination for humanity, that Jesus has something in mind that is followers would do the works that Jesus does in an even greater way than what he was doing, has been a really tantalizing idea. And I've held varieties of opinions about what I think that means and the implication of that in my own life and the lives of other people. I want to tell you how I'm thinking about that right now because I'm super excited about it. I think what Jesus is getting at is that there's an imagination that's wrapped that sometimes gets coined in the phrase the kingdom of God, that there is a calling of God that's bigger than the calling of the kingdom of David, and it's bigger than the calling of the kingdom of Caesar of Jesus' day, and it's something that's bigger than the calling of our nationalistic tendencies in this country, or of our sensibilities of our limitations, or our temperaments, or our genders. There's some idea that Jesus has that we would be called into a way of life that is really robust and is going to be all about the things that Jesus is about, and then some. So that phrase, "Those who believe in me will do the works that I'm doing and do even greater works than these," I put together in a book with the subtitle. The title of it is "Greater Than," and the subtitle is "How Ordinary People Are Outdoing Jesus and Why It's Good News." So I think Jesus' expectation for what he's saying to the people he was gathered with and his sense of the future of humanity is that he's the starting line of a way of humanity, not some great finishing line that we're all trying to get to. Sort of the way that a parent might think about their child and hoping and dreaming and wishing that their child would grow up and take whatever the parent has given the child in their biology and in their social setting and in their passions and desires, and wants them to take it from there and to go further. That no parent I know who loves and wants the very best for their children wants to hold their child back and make them always stay behind them and never outdo them. We all want to be outdone by those who are going to follow us. I think Jesus had the same mentality, had the same expectation. I think Jesus is someone who understood the world to be one where human beings and the divine dwell together, where the animating spirit of God, the animating spirit of the divine would be alive in a person and give their life fullness and human flourishing to the ultimate capacity. And that was not something that was a one-off exceptional experience in Jesus. It's something that is in all of us so that we all live an exceptional kind of life in our own context and our own setting. So that idea, there's going to be a future and a history and a life that's going to be so much greater than even the things Jesus is doing, can really freak some people out. And I'll tell you, there was a period of time where I was concerned that if I was saying to myself or saying out loud to other people, there's a kind of spirituality where you're supposed to do the Jesus-y things and then step it up a little in your own context, that somehow was diminishing Jesus. I don't know if that's crossed your mind or not, but one of the things you don't want to do in any system you're in, you don't want to feel like you're talking down or you're extending yourself over some leader or some great teacher. I mean, most of us look at any great teacher, even the one that doesn't reach, in our own minds, the level of Jesus, and we think, oh my gosh, I don't do anything close to what those people do. You just start rattling them off in your head. Think about your sort of heroes of your faith. Maybe they're famous people that you've never met, or maybe they're people that are in your family. And you tend to find yourself saying things like, if I get anywhere close to that, that would be great. So our own self-perceptions tend to be that we don't want to really do a Jesus-level thing. Now, that phrase, "Those who believe in me will do the works I'm doing and do even greater works than these," is only found in the Gospel of John. And I think that matters. So here's why. Not to be a Bible nerd for too long on a Saturday morning, but let me be a Bible nerd for just a minute. There's 4 Gospels. A lot of us know that already. And 3 of those Gospels are very similar to each other. In fact, sometimes scholars and people that study the Bible like to give them a little nickname by calling them the synoptics. They're similar to each other. Then there's the Gospel of John, which is really different. Gospel of John tells the story of Jesus' life in a different order. It includes a whole set of stories. Well, the Gospel of John is the only one that records Jesus saying this phrase. Now, I think Jesus says something really similar in the other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when he says things like, you are the light of the world and you are the salt of the earth. He's granting to people that kind of power that was in his day granted to Torah, the light of the world and the salt of the earth. He's granting that to people in a field sitting together and saying, without exception, all of you are about that. But in the Gospel of John, he says it a little differently. The Gospel of John writers put it together in such a way that Jesus says, oh no, you're going to do my stuff and you're going to do it in an even greater fashion than this. And Jesus says that just after he's completed 7 works that are recorded in the Gospel of John. Here's where it gets important. That phrase, Jesus says, those who believe in me will do the works I'm doing. The Gospel of John is designed, structured around 7 what are often called miracles and 7 I am statements. And those frame the narrative of the Gospel of John all the way up to the 14th chapter. Now, the Gospel of John starts out with a poem of creation. Just like the book of Genesis starts out with a creation poem that goes, in the beginning, God created, and then goes through 7 days of creation. The Gospel of John is trying to describe a creation of a new way of humanity. So it starts out with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then it unfolds 7 works, almost like 7 days of creation. So it's structured around these 7 works as the 7 days of the creation of a new kind of a humanity. Then the 8th day, by the way, becomes Jesus' resurrection. And the resurrection of Jesus is now the new humanity being recreated and living in that new story in the 8th day, where now all the power of death has been defeated. And death, not that your body doesn't die, but death where it's brought by violence is now done away with. That we no longer achieve the works of humanity and God via violence that'll bring about death. Because subtext, way deep down in the footnotes, the crucifixion of Jesus was not just Jesus dying. It was Jesus being executed by a violent system. And the resurrection is the biggest execution by violent systems didn't work statement that you can make. I have a friend that says the resurrection is sort of giving the finger to the execution. It didn't work. So Jesus' thing is not just don't die. Jesus' thing is don't use death and violence as power. Back to the context. So 7 creation narratives inside the Gospel of John. And it's those 7 works that Jesus refers to when he says, those who believe in me will do the works that I'm doing and do even greater works than these. Okay, in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there's all kinds of miraculous signs. They don't always feel like they're in an order. They're just kind of happening, and they're sort of a potluck of miracles, right? They're kind of all around. You can read anywhere and sort of get the point of the story. But the Gospel of John puts them in a particular order, and there's only 7 of them. And of the 7, 5 of the miracles that are in the Gospel of John, the miraculous works, are not in the other Gospels. They are unique to the Gospel of John. And the 2 that seem like they share the story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the feeding of the thousands and the walking on water. And those 2 stories are told in such a different way than they are in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that the conclusion of them seems really different than they are in the synoptics. So even those 2, to summarize, those 7 works are unique to the Gospel of John. Because what John is doing in that gospel, the authors of John, is creating a narrative that people are to follow in the creation of a new kind of humanity. Jesus' point is to express that he embodies a kind of humanity that can become accessible to all. So Jesus' story is something bigger and better and brighter than just, we're going to live out a narrative right now, and then later you're going to get all the rewards of it. It is, you can live this life in the here and the now, and this is what it would look like. So the Gospel of John, just in its own sense, is this really fun read as you read the 7 works and then the 7 I ams that go with it. So the Gospel of John is really sophisticated in its organization. and it's going to move through these seven. So I want to do a little guesswork, a little crowd guessing here. If you can remember what the seven miraculous signs, the seven works are in the Gospel of John. All right? Let's start with the first one. Anybody know what the first one is? Water into wine. Good. The water into wine is the first one. What's the second? Healing the boy from a distance. Yeah, it's one that people often forget. Good for you. Oh, you were there yesterday. That's awesome. I did this talk yesterday. Oh, this talk is it's either so good or so confusing you had to hear it twice. Yeah, he heals a boy from a distance. All right, the third one. In the Gospel of John, there's no healing of a daughter. That's in one of the other Gospels. Nothing wrong with that. It's very similar. In fact, the healing of the boy sort of looks like the version of a healing of a daughter in another one, in another story. So it could feel very similar. The person who touches his garment. So that is in the Gospel of John, but it's not considered one of the miraculous signs. It's kind of curious because this woman comes up behind Jesus and she hasn't been able to stop the bleeding and to live a full life for 12 years and comes up behind him and grabs a hold of him and the bleeding is healed. And that's the one that's connected to that daughter. But in that case, the Gospel of John doesn't refer to that as one of the miraculous signs. It's really curious. All right. Anybody else want to keep going? So we've got two, the healing of the boy from a distance, the water into wine. The raising of Lazarus, that's going to be the seventh one. In fact, little side note in case I don't get there, the raising of Lazarus is a great way to say it. What a lot of us have been taught to say is the resurrection of Lazarus. I actually think, I should go off mic for this because this is really scandalous. I actually think it's the opposite of a resurrection story. It's an unresurrection story. What happens in that story is that Lazarus, the friend of Jesus, dies. You might remember, and he doesn't go. And there's all this stuff about he sleeps and he'll wake up and kind of back and forth, and it's confusing. And Jesus is friends with Lazarus and then friends with his two sisters, Mary and Martha, who are kind of the stars of the whole thing. In fact, in the Gospel of John, the women are always the stars of the scenes. From the beginning, the miracle of changing water into wine, it's his mom who has the idea, all the way to the end where it's Mary and Martha, all the way in between, it's a woman narrative. And the resurrection is seen by the women followers of Jesus, and they're not believed by the men. All right, so anyway, so sort of side note. But in that story, Martha and Mary are frustrated because Jesus wasn't there to do something about their brother Lazarus dying. And when Jesus shows up, you might remember the conversation where they say, had you been here, he wouldn't have died. And then Jesus says, do you believe in the resurrection? And they say, we believe in the resurrection in the last day. And Jesus says, you got to set that aside. Because if you keep holding on to an idea that there's going to be something, some other time that's going to solve the situation that you're in right now, it's going to demotivate you to solve the problem right now. So leave behind your resurrection narrative, go down to the tomb, move the rock, and get the dead guy out. What Jesus is saying is don't wait for the resurrection because that's putting off the solution that you should do right now. So Jesus raising Lazarus is to say to her, the resurrection is not the thing to hold on to. The resurrection becomes a really big deal in Jesus' narrative. But look, Lazarus isn't resurrected. He dies later. I mean, what kind of a resurrection is that? That's sort of an air punch. It's a fake. That's not what anybody, even Mary and Martha, would have referred to as resurrection. That's not what happens in the story. The reason the resurrection comes up is so that Jesus can say, I am that resurrection. Meaning it's now, it's not later. Okay, that's super fun and we could talk about that for days. In fact, people have been talking about that for 2,000 years. It's so good. All right, so there's the water into wine. There's a healing of the child from a distance. There's a raising of Lazarus. Yeah, the feeding of the thousands. Yeah, I gave that one away. So the feeding of the thousands and the walking on water. The healing of the blind man. Oh, it's just the greatest. I mean, if you ever have to do like a camp talk, it's just perfect, right? Because you get to use the mud and the dirt and all this kind of stuff. That's the one where the man's born blind his whole life. Jesus comes up to him. And by the way, in almost all the miracles that happen in the Gospel of John, all 7 of them, none of the recipients ask for Jesus to do anything about their problem. None of them. Obviously, Lazarus doesn't say anything about it. You've already got that one. the water into wine, the person who's the beneficiary of the water into the wine story is the groom and the bride, because it's their wedding that doesn't get ruined, and the shame doesn't come upon the bride and the groom. They don't even know that it happened. They're the beneficiaries of the first miracle of Jesus without them even knowing it happened. Jesus does something in that water to wine story because his mother asks him to do it. And he seemingly is hesitant, doesn't want to, says, this isn't even my time. And she's like, look, this guy's going to get humiliated at his wedding. You need to do something, and you need to do something about it now. So he takes these big jars that are used for ceremonial washing purposes, religious jars, turns them into wine so that the wedding party can keep going. Jesus is a party savior long before he's seen as humanity's savior. And he takes the religious tool and uses it as a party favor. That's not accidental. That Jesus says it's more important that we save this person's reputation and this party than we save the religious items that are used for purification. It's incredible. What's happening here is the story in the Gospel of John is starting to lay out how you would recreate a new kind of humanity. So in a lot of ways, what's happening in that first story is that we're hearing the story of celebration. And then what happens in the healing of that boy is that you hear a story of empathy. Because the healing of that boy is that this dad doesn't want his boy to die. Jesus heals from a distance, and this becomes this whole narrative about how you don't even have to be there. It's this great, beautiful imagery that space and time isn't what we think it is. I mean, Einstein reminded us of that in like 1906, and the Gospel of John's been trying to remind us of that since 106, that space and time is not where the limitation comes. Some of you know that already. You experience that. The highly intuitive and energy kind of people in the room, and the people that feel that kind of power and feel that sort of ability to be connected with somebody else, and that there's some kind of movement. You read that story of Jesus saying that the boy's going to be healed, and the very time that he says it, that happens. You understand that. So what's happening in this story is not that Jesus is breaking the laws of physics. That's not what a miraculous sign is. A miraculous sign is when we break the logjam of our own expectations about what the laws of physics are. And especially our own spirituality. All right, so we've got the water into wine. We've got the boy from a distance. The third one is often forgotten in the Gospel of John. It's familiar to one in another book in the other Gospels. Anybody remember? It involves a man. The Bethesda. Oh, there we go. Somebody's keeping up on his seminary classes. This is the one where the man is by the pool. Maybe you remember, Jesus walks up, and there's and it's where and the little side note in the Gospel of John says, and it was a place where many of the lame and sick would sit. So Jesus walks up, and remember this, he says to the man, do you want to get well? A great question. Jesus doesn't suppose or presuppose that he's going to tell the guy what he should do. The new humanity that Jesus is showing starts with somebody who has capacity granting full agency and respect to someone that they want to make an offer to. You don't force it on anyone. Do you want? I have a want. Do you have a want? In fact, starting the question to yourself and to others, who are you and what are your wants, is a really good question. A lot of us have been told in our Christian spirituality, the first thing you need to do, get rid of in your life is your own wants. Somewhere along the line, we've been told that we're the problem, and those problems manifest in what we want and we desire. It's a great story. Jesus walks up and says to the guy, what do you want? Do you want to get well? And then the guy says this curious thing, right? Well, every time the water gets stirred, I can't get in because somebody cuts in front of me. And Jesus says, take up your mat and go. In writing the book, I had realized, and even like in the chapter headings when I was framing out the book, I'd realized, the book Greater Than that I wrote about all this, that I realized I've always assumed the man was paralyzed. Maybe you thought that too. Maybe you thought about it as the paralytic man, as I wrote like in my little outline, when I was putting this together. Once you get into the story and you really spend time in there, I injected the idea that man's paralyzed. The story doesn't say he's paralyzed. It says there are people there with all kinds of illness and people that are, some version of your Bible, lame or couldn't walk or are paralyzed. But it doesn't say that about this guy. He could have had all manner of things that caused him to have to sit on that mat and not be well. There's all kinds of things that cause us not to walk. He could have had some sort of a neurological problem. He could have had a sight problem. He could have had deep, deep vertigo and fell over. There's all kinds of things. The point being, we all tend to read into stories. And then they get made in our image rather than letting that story come alive. And that's not just true about Bible stories. It's true about people. We tend to look at someone and be like, oh, no, I got you figured out. I know who you are. I know what your thing is. I can read you. I know what's up with you. All right, so we're missing a couple of them. There's the pool. It's the feeding of the 5,000. The walking on water. The walking on water in this one is so bizarre. In the other versions of the Gospels, they tell it as like they thought it was a ghost and they were all afraid. In this storyline, it's all about night is coming and what's going to come in the morning. This whole story in the Gospel of John is set up that fear is the thing that's wrapping around the people in the boat. And the thing they're afraid of is that the storm is going to be too strong. But Jesus doesn't calm the storm in this. He only calms the fears of the people. So you've got this narrative that starts with water into wine. Now what you're going to notice as you make your way through this is water plays a role in five of the miracles. Water into wine. Then he heals the boy from a distance. Then he heals the man at the pool. We've got water again. Then he feeds the people on the hillside. Have I lost one? Yeah, thanks. He heals the man. He heals the man born blind with his spit and with the water again. Then he heals. Then he does the 5,000. Then he walks on water. Then he's got Lazarus. So this starts to create a narrative that takes you from the party saving all the way back through the life in the community. So what it's arcing is a way of humanity that brings about the fullness where everyone's a participant. In the Gospel of John, there's always someone else who's a participant in the miraculous work. The feeding of the 5,000 in the Gospel of John is the only one in which Jesus says, there's a little boy here who's got loaves and fish. Start handing it out. The little boy is the star of the story. In the other Gospels, it just has Jesus saying, just start handing out bread and fish. Like, just get some, right? But in this story, in John, it all angles around the little boy. The Gospel of John wants you to know there's no way you can tell the miraculous stories of Jesus without the stories of the people that are involved and engaged. There's conversations, there's engagement, there's collaborators, they're always involved. The man who's born blind, he has to go to the pool and wash it off. The man sitting by the pool has to be the one who gets up. The little boy has to be there. The people in the boat have to be afraid. The people at Lazarus' tomb, they have to move the tomb. The servants at the wedding, they have to bring over the wine jars, and the people have to drink the wine out of the wine jars. There's always other people. In the Gospel of John, in the new humanity that is creating, Jesus is not just going around making things right. Jesus is going around whooping up a bunch of collaborators. So then when it gets to chapter 14, Jesus says, okay, all that stuff we've done, that creation and recreation of a new imagination of humanity, we're just getting started. In the future, those who live in this way, believe in me, those who live in this way, they are going to do this kind of thing and do even greater works than these because we're just getting started. So in this, the thing that got interesting to me is thinking about all the different ways that people save celebrations. The ways that people cross boundaries, the ways that people help people overcome their fears, the way that people distribute foods, the way that people heal young boys that are sick from a distance. In 1850, there was not a country in the world where life expectancy was above 40 years old. Nowhere in the world. In 2018, there's not a country in the world where life expectancy is below 45. The reason for that is not that people before 1850 didn't live to be older than 40 years old. Life expectancy is the average age at which people die. People were living to be 60, 70, 80, 90 years old in 1850, but children were dying at such a high rate that it brought life expectancy averages down to 40 years old. The reason life expectancy has gone up is not just that older people are getting older, but that child mortality rates have dropped. It's an impressive story that Jesus heals one boy from a distance. It's even more impressive that across the globe, we've stopped children from dying. That's a greater than kind of thing. And what has caused the most significant salvation of children's lives, keeping them from dying as infants, has been sanitation. And not even what we do just with our garbage, primarily what we do with our urine and our fecal matter. Pee and poop kills. This is why in the Old Testament you'll read things, in the Jewish scriptures about make certain spots a long way from the camp. Because if you're drinking that water and if you're getting infected with those diseases that come from pee and poop, you die. Sanitation is what is saving lives. When you see these little porta potties around here and you're like, oh my gosh, maybe I'll just hold it and try to get to something more permanent, and like me, you got to Wild Goose and maybe you'll have a bowel movement when you get home, right? Because some mental block kicks in where you're just like, I'm not going into that little plastic hut of poop and I'm not going in there. So in our society now, because we have indoor plumbing, and we have sanitation, and we wash our hands, and we have Perel, and all this kind of thing, we look at those little plastic rooms and just think, I'm going to skip it. But you go to parts of Africa, and when those things come rolling in, moms and dads cry because they know their kids are going to survive. Porta potties, thank you. Porta potties have saved millions of children's lives. Well, even before you get to wells and clean drinking water, just being able to have places for sanitation and garbage has saved lives. So the kind of great, and I know it can seem like when you see a sanitation truck roll by, you don't look and think, well, there's a modern day miracle worker. Those are modern day miracle workers. It's an impressive thing that Jesus says to a little boy, hey, you got any fish? You got any bread in there? It's even more impressive to consider people who are figuring out a way to distribute food to 7 billion people on the planet. I mean, it's kind of impressive that a few thousand people could eat for half a day on a hillside and their blood sugar didn't drop, but they weren't going to starve. Feeding 7 billion people on the planet, and the only reason we don't feed all of them significantly is because of a distribution problem and because of governments that prevent it from happening. We have the capacity to not only feed 7 billion people, but 12 billion people on this planet. Is a modern day work of greatness. It's incredible. It's impressive to secretly save a wedding. But those of you who find people in your life, in your community that people forget about, look past, and don't cheer for, and to create a space in which their lives are honored and lifted up and cheered on, those are modern day greater than works. It's kind of impressive to walk on water. I got to tell you, that's a really big deal, and I had a really fun time writing that chapter. Because I live in Minnesota, and 4 months of the year, we walk on water all the time. We just call it ice, and then we walk on the water, right? No, it's a really fun chapter to write, because fear that they experience in that boat is really, really significant because it shows up in all of our lives. And those of us who woke up last night riddled with fear, or the night before, or anxiety is hanging over us all the time, and we feel that paralyzed sense of maybe it's going to collapse, maybe I'm going to drown, maybe it's not going to work, maybe I'm a failure, maybe. All of that somebody in their friendship, someone talking with you, someone offering you an herb or a medicine that helps you to live free from that is a modern day great work. It's super impressive to say to a man who's had lots of excuses for why he's not in the pool, to say, maybe you just do it right now and don't wait for the next moment to be just right. To live in the present right now instead of waiting for a future time when everything's going to be right. That's great work. But when you can say that to your lover or to your spouse or to your child or to your parents, let's just live in right now. Some of us have greatly benefited from moving from a destination-sensed life, like where I'm going to a sense of enjoying the journey that we're on. The next step is to just literally enjoy right here and right now. You're not even on a journey. You're just here. That presence, that fullness, everything you need right here, right now, to live in that frees people to grab that old mat and leave it beside and to live their lives. Some of us think, I'm a pastor and I just talk to these people and I don't even know if it does any good. And it seems like there's no measurable difference in their lives, whether they were part of this community or not. Now, I say that as a pastor, so maybe you don't feel that kind of thing, but I feel that sort of thing. Some days I don't know if it does any good or not. And then you hear the story about the person that said, I really, really felt like I was stuck. And I feel like I'm living now. It's incredible. It is something to say to a man, I'm going to spit on the ground, make up a mud pack, sneak up on you, which frankly is not a very nice thing to a man who can't see. But anyway, in this case, without his permission, right, wipes it on his eyes and then, says, why don't you go wash that off, right? And he goes to the pool and doesn't know who it is who did it, acts in a way that brings about a healing in which Jesus gets no credit. In fact, days later, when the man is being confronted about his interaction with Jesus, the people in the temple say, who was it that did this? And the guy's like, I don't know. Isn't that great? I don't know. To be reminded that we can see without knowing, that seeing and knowing are not the same thing, that you can perceive without fully understanding is so helpful. There's so much demand in our society that you know the right thing. And this story just says, maybe you have the ability to see without even being able to explain. The seers among us, you know what that's like because you know it. You see it. You sense it. You feel it. And then someone says, well, why? Well, how? Who was it? What do you mean? And you're like, I don't know. And you can feel yourself just getting blinded again. It's an incredible story. Look, to call a guy out of a tomb that's been dead for 3.5, 4 days, that's seriously a good one. I had somebody say, look, I don't know what you're going to do when you get to that seventh miracle, because all the rest of these, I could sort of imagine one that would be equally as powerful as calling the dead back to life, but ain't nobody doing that. That's not bringing a portaloo to Africa, right? That's something else. That's a whole other thing. I don't have time to get into the whole story now, but at 3 o'clock today, Shane Claiborne and I are doing a session down in the Greater Things tent called Breaking Badass, how two nice Jesus-following guys find themselves in jail all the time. And one of the times Shane and I were in jail wasn't because we were being punished, but we were visiting men on death row at Riverbend Penitentiary on death row in Tennessee. And these men on death row built a table of reconciliation that they meet around every day. And they tell each other stories of life while they are locked up in cages waiting for the state of Tennessee to take their life. Some of them are in their 50s. They're incredible men. They've been in some of them since they were 19, 25 years old. Many of them had one moment of violent, horrible, devastating rage that they live with every day when they live in a 6x6 cell and get out for a few hours a day to sit around a table with other murderers and talk about how they can live a full and complete life. It's something to talk about life with death hanging over your head on death row and wanting to call these men out. There's a lot of us who feel dead in a lot of areas in our lives, and we feel ourselves coming to life. There's a lot of people who are on the brink of death all the time and are called back. And if you've been called back by people from that suicidal edge, you know that you were as good as dead. And if somebody had said, well, another time, another place is probably all going to be all right, wouldn't have sufficed. There is a way of humanity that we are already doing. Jesus' whole thing is the already doing. There's this little phrase some of us like in theology called the already and the not yet. I kind of like it, especially if you drop the second half. Like, worry about the not yet a little later. Worry about the already right now and recognize the greatness in all of us so that Jesus is not in competition with us. God does not see you as a threat to God's glory. You will do even greater works than these. I think that's a pretty good thing to live by. Hey, thanks. Hope I didn't take more time than I'm supposed to.